Okinawa, May 1945. On a 400-foot vertical cliff face the Americans called Hacksaw Ridge, a 26-year-old Army medic named Desmond Thomas Doss dragged another bleeding soldier toward the precipice in total darkness. Skinny, barely 140 pounds, with wire-rimmed glasses that fogged in tropical heat and a soft Virginia accent that made him sound younger than he was, Doss looked like he belonged in a church choir, not a battlefield. To his exhausted company, he was a strange Seventh-day Adventist who refused to carry a rifle, who read his Bible every night by flashlight, who knelt in prayer while mortars screamed overhead. But every time the stretcher-bearers retreated and the gunfire intensified, he moved forward into ground so hot with enemy fire that nothing living should have survived there. He carried a secret that meant certain execution if the Japanese understood it. He believed every life was sacred, including theirs, and that conviction made him untouchable in ways no weapon could. He had already lowered one man down the cliff, then another, not 5 men, not 20, 75 American soldiers by dawn, each one somebody's son or brother or father, each one bleeding out in the mud with minutes to live. He made them vanish from that killing field, as if death itself had looked away. The ridge was not just high ground. This was the western gateway to Japan's final defensive line, honeycombed with caves and tunnels packed with soldiers who had sworn to die rather than surrender. The air tasted of cordite and copper. Flies gathered in black clouds on the bodies nobody could reach. Screams echoed from the cave mouths where wounded men hid, Japanese and American voices blending into the same terrible sound. The ground shook with artillery every few minutes, throwing red dirt into air that already choked the lungs. Doss's job gave him access to morphine, bandages, and plasma, and the legal authority to move through combat zones where even officers fear to go. But Desmond Doss was not what he seemed. #, the making of Conscience Desmond, was born February 7, 1919, in Lynchburg, Virginia, the middle child of a carpenter and shoe factory worker who raised their children in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. His father, Tom, was a First World War veteran who came home with a drinking problem and a loaded pistol he waved during arguments with Desmond's uncle. His mother, Bertha, taught her children that the Sixth Commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," meant exactly what it said, no exceptions, no asterisks, not even in war. They were poor, depression poor, the kind where you wore cardboard in your shoes and felt grateful for it. But they had faith, structure, Saturday Sabbath worship, and a framed picture on the living room wall that Desmond stared for hours as a child. Cain standing over Abel's body. The caption reading, "What have you done?" He was 17 when he saw the accident that changed everything. Route 29 outside Lynchburg, summer evening, 1936. A logging truck lost its brakes coming down Seminary Hill and jackknifed it across both lanes. Desmond ran toward the wreckage with other bystanders and found the driver pinned in the cab, femoral arteries severed, blood pumping onto the floorboards in rhythmic spurts. The man's eyes were open and aware. He knew he was dying. Someone shouted to get a doctor, but the nearest hospital was 20 minutes away, and this man had maybe 3. Desmond pressed his bare hands into the wound, felt the hot blood slowing under his palms, heard the driver's breathing shift from panic to something calmer. The man lived until the ambulance arrived. Desmond's shirt was ruined. His hands shook for an hour afterward, but he had felt something in that moment that he recognized as purpose, the strange physics of saving a life, how pressure in the right place could reverse entropy, could pull someone back from the edge. He started taking first aid courses at the local church, studying anatomy books from the public library, practicing splints and tourniquets on his younger brother Harold until their mother made him stop. When Pearl Harbor was bombed in December 1941, Desmond was 22, working at a shipyard in Newport News with deferment that would have kept him out of the war entirely. The pay was good. He had just married Dorothy Schutte, a woman he met at church who understood his beliefs. Most Seventh-day Adventists were registering as conscientious objectors, taking non-combat roles or refusing service altogether. Desmond could have stayed home, built ships, stayed safe. Instead, in April 1942, he walked into the recruiting office in Lynchburg and enlisted in the Army as a combat medic, insisting on a classification that would put him on the front lines. The recruiter thought he was insane. His father threatened to disown him. Dorothy begged him to reconsider. The church elders said he was making a mistake that would destroy his faith. But Desmond had worked out the logic in his mind, and it was airtight. If killing was wrong, then every life was equally valuable, which meant American soldiers bleeding in foxholes deserved the same chance as the logging truck driver on Route 29. He would serve. He would deploy. He would go wherever the fighting was worst. He just wouldn't carry a rifle. As he told the recruiter, "I don't know how I'm going to live with myself if I don't try." He shipped out to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, for basic training in the spring of 1942, assigned to the 77th Infantry Division's Medical Detachment, with official papers listing him as a conscientious cooperator, a category the Army had basically invented for him. His uniform looked like everyone else's except for the empty holster on his hip. His commanding officer, Captain Vernon, took one look at him and predicted he'd be dead within a week of combat. The system seemed foolproof. It wasn't. Hashtag the method and the madness the American military in 1943 ran on a simple principle. Every soldier must be able to kill. This wasn't philosophy, it was logistics. Infantry doctrine assumed 10 to 15% casualty rates in major assaults, which meant units needed overwhelming firepower to advance. Medics carried pistols for self-defense. Chaplains carried sidearms. Even cooks and clerks qualified on rifles. The penalty for refusing to bear arms was court-martial, dishonorable discharge, and up to 5 years in military prison. This wasn't theoretical. The Army had prosecuted 43 conscientious objectors in 1942 alone. The logic was unbreakable. If you won't defend yourself, you're a liability. If you're a liability, you endanger your unit. If you endanger your unit, you're effectively collaborating with the enemy. The machine had no tolerance for exceptions. But the machine overlooked something. It had never encountered a medic who was willing to go places even armed soldiers wouldn't. Desmond discovered the flaw during his first month at Fort Jackson. While his company ran rifle drills, he spent double time on medical training, plasma administration, sucking chest wound treatment, arterial bleeds, shock management. While they practiced marksmanship, he studied the company's battle formations, memorizing where every squad would position themselves, where casualties would most likely fall, which terrain features offered defilade from enemy fire. He wasn't training to fight. He was training to navigate battlefields the way a chess master navigates boards, seeing 3 moves ahead, anticipating where men would fall before the shooting started. His method developed in stages. First, master the technical skills. He could apply a tourniquet in 12 seconds, in the dark, with one hand. He practiced pressure bandages until his fingers moved automatically. He memorized dosage calculations for morphine, so he never had to check the label in combat. Second, build physical endurance. He volunteered for every long march, every obstacle course, every punishment detail that involved carrying weight. His frame was slight, but he developed a wiry strength, the kind that doesn't quit. Third, eliminate fear responses. He forced himself to stay calm during live-fire exercises, to focus on medical priorities instead of survival instincts. When artillery simulators went off, he practiced walking toward the sound instead of away from it. The first test came on July 29, 1944, on Guam. His company assaulted a Japanese position on the Oro Peninsula and walked into a killing field, machine gun fire from concealed pillboxes, grenades dropping from palm trees, mortar rounds landing so close the shrapnel hummed. 3 men went down in the first 30 seconds. The stretcher bearers dove for cover. Desmond ran forward. Private First Class James Doris, age 19, from Topeka, Kansas, took rounds through both legs and lay screaming in the open 75 yards from American lines. Every soldier who tried to reach him drew fire. Desmond crawled the distance on his elbows, dragged Doris into a shell crater, tied off the arteries, administered morphine, and then, this was the part that made no tactical sense, stood up and carried Doris on his back across open ground while Japanese rifles tracked him the entire way. He walked slowly. He didn't zigzag. He moved like a man delivering mail, not escaping death. He delivered Doris to the aid station and turned around to retrieve the next wounded man before anyone could stop him. The risks were cataloged by his commanding officer that night. Move engine open terrain under direct fire. 90% casualty rate. Exposure time of 3 to 5 minutes per rescue. Mathematically unsurvivable. No suppressing fire support. Enemy could aim without pressure. Visible blurred cross on helmet. Made him a priority target under Japanese doctrine. Each strip revealed American casualty positions to enemy observers if caught by Japanese forces. The Geneva Convention meant nothing. Medics were routinely bayonet or shot on sight. His own survival instinct should have stopped him. The laws of probability should have stopped him. He saved 4 men on Guam that day. He saved 7 more at Leyte in the Philippines 2 months later. His company started calling him the Angel of the 77th. His captain stopped writing him up for insubordination. By the time they shipped out for Okinawa in April 1945, Desmond Doss had saved 32 lives. And the battalion knew that when the shooting started, the weird kid with a Bible and no rifle would be the one walking toward the sound of screaming. But how much longer before luck ran out? Hashtag, when the system broke, the first convocation arrived at Fort Jackson on a Wednesday morning in June 1942, 3 months into basic training. Desmond had been requesting weekend leave every Saturday for Sabbath worship, reporting back Sunday mornings. This violated no regulation. The Army allowed religious observation. But enraged Sergeant Howell, a career NCO who viewed any exception to routine as personal disrespect. That Wednesday, Howell called Desmond into his office and told him his Sabbath leave was revoked indefinitely. No explanation. No appeal process. Just orders. Desmond felt his chest tighten. His hands went cold. At night, lying in his bunk, he calculated the equation. If he refused, they'd court-martial him. If he accepted, he'd violate the 4th commandment, break his covenant with God, invalidate the entire reason he enlisted. If he argued, he'd be marked as a troublemaker and guarantee worse treatment. He spent 2 nights without sleep, praying, reading the same Bible passages until the words blurred. On Friday, he made his choice. He went to Sabbath worship anyway. He walked off base without permission, attended services at the Lynchburg Seventh-day Adventist Church, and returned Sunday morning to find Sergeant Howell waiting with 2 MPs. Howell screamed his face for 20 minutes. Desmond stood at attention, said nothing, and accepted punishment detail, peeling potatoes for 200 men every meal for 2 weeks. His fingers blistered and bled. The company watched him work, some with sympathy, most with contempt. But the next Saturday, he did it again, and the next. After 5 weeks, Captain Vernon intervened and restored his Sabbath leave. Howell never spoke to him again. But this created a worse problem. Now the entire company knew he put his religion above his unit, and in the closed world of an infantry division, that marked him as fundamentally untrustworthy. Before he could process that isolation, the escalation intensified. In August 1942, during Rifle Qualification Week, Desmond refused to touch a weapon. The drill sergeant ordered him to pick up an M1 Garand for basic familiarization. Desmond declined. The sergeant offered a compromise. Just hold it. No firing required. Desmond declined. The situation spiraled. The company formed up to watch. The sergeant threatened him with court-martial. Desmond stood there, skinny and quiet, explaining that even handling a rifle violated his conscience. The sergeant called him a coward. Someone in formation shouted traitor. That night, 2 soldiers cornered him in the latrine and beat him badly enough to crack a rib. The internal state that night was physiological. Desmond vomited twice from pain and shock. His hands shook when he tried to write a letter to Dorothy. He lay in his bunk, feeling his heartbeat in his broken rib, hearing the whispered conversations around him, knowing that some men in his unit wanted him dead, and there was no authority he could appeal to. The metaphor he used in a letter home was simple. I feel like Daniel in the lion's den, except the lions wear the same uniform I do. The impossible choice had clarified. If he stayed, he risked being killed by his own side before seeing combat. If he quit, he'd abandon the mission that had brought him here. If he fought back, he'd become exactly what they accused him of being, a man who solved problems with violence. He spent 1 hour praying in the chapel. His choice was the only one he'd ever considered. Stay Endure. Prove him wrong through action rather than argument. The next morning, he reported for duty with his rib taped, worked double shifts in the aid station, and volunteered to carry the heaviest medical packs during training marches. The message was silent but clear. You can hurt me, but you can't make me quit. Some soldiers respected it. Most just wanted him transferred before he got someone killed. The outcome was a meeting with Captain Vernon, who told him directly, Doss, I'm recommending you for psychiatric evaluation. I think you're mentally unfit for combat. Desmond listened, nodded, and said he'd accept any evaluation but wouldn't change his position. The psych eval took 3 hours. The Army psychiatrist concluded Desmond was entirely sane, just deeply religious. Vernon had no grounds for discharge. But this created a new consequence. Now the captain was personally invested in proving Desmond was wrong, and he had the authority to make that proof deadly. Before he could navigate that minefield, in November 1942, the company held a vote. Vernon assembled the entire unit, 93 men, and asked by show of hands, who wants Private Doss transferred to a non-combat support role? 87 hands went up. The public humiliation was complete. Desmond stood at attention, while his own brothers-in-arms voted to expel him. That night, alone in his bunk, he felt a darkness he'd never experienced, a kind of despair that made him question whether he'd misunderstood God's plan entirely. His breathing went shallow. His vision tunneled. He couldn't pray. For the first time since enlisting, he considered whether they were right. Maybe he was putting men at risk. Maybe his conscience was just cowardice with better branding. Maybe the right thing was to go home. The choice took 3 days. He read letters from Dorothy. He remembered the logging truck driver, the way the man's eyes had changed when the bleeding stopped. He thought about the 32 men he'd saved in training accidents, broken bones, training injuries. One guy who nearly died from a brown recluse spider bite. On the 4th day, he told Captain Vernon he was staying. Vernon told him he was insane. The transfer vote was ignored. But this created an irreversible situation. Now he had to prove himself in actual combat, and if he failed, men would die because he'd been too stubborn to quit. That proof began on July 21st, 1944, at Guam. The second complication hit during the Oro Peninsula assault. Desmond's company advanced through jungle so thick the sunlight came down in narrow columns. Japanese snipers were tied into the canopy, invisible until they fired. The company took fire from 3 directions simultaneously. Desmond heard the bullets snapping past, sounding like someone cracking a whip next his ear. He dropped into a crouch and saw Private Doss go down, both legs destroyed. The stretcher bearers yelled for covering fire, but there was nowhere to shoot. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Here was the complication. Doss was a soldier who'd beaten him in the latrine at Fort Jackson, who'd called him a coward in front of the company, who'd told in his face that he hoped Desmond died first so he could watch. Now Doss was screaming for help, and the screaming had Desmond's name in it. The internal state was a kind of clarity. No anger, no hesitation. Just a technical problem of how to cross 75 yards of open ground without dying. His hands were steady. His breathing slowed. He thought, if I crawl, it takes 4 minutes and he bleeds out. If I run, I'm dead in seconds. If I walk, slowly, like I belong here, maybe their training makes them hesitate. It was the kind of calculation that only makes sense in the moment, the kind of tactical insanity that becomes legend if you survive and stupidity if you don't. He walked, slowly, directly toward the screaming. Japanese rifles tracked him, but nobody fired. He reached Doss, dragged him into a shell crater, tied off the arteries with such focus that he forgot where he was. The morphine went in clean. The plasma bag hung from a broken tree branch. Doss stopped screaming and started crying and said, "I'm sorry," over and over. Desmond said nothing, just wrapped the legs, checked for shock, and then did the unthinkable. He stood up with Doss on his back and walked toward American lines at the same measured pace. Bullets kicked up dirt to his left and right, but none connected. He delivered Doss, turned around, and went back for the next man before anyone could stop him. The outcome was immediate respect from the company. Doss survived, shipped home, and wrote Desmond's mother a letter calling her son the bravest man he'd ever known. But this created a new consequence. Now the brass expected miracles, and every future battle will be measured against Guam. Before he could absorb that pressure, October 1944 brought the third complication at Leyte in the Philippines. His company assaulted a Japanese position on Hill 522, a mud-slick ridge crawling with enemy troops dug into bunkers and spider holes. The assault stalled under machine gun fire. 12 men went down in the first wave. Desmond moved forward through mortar fire to reach them, working triage in a bomb crater, 3 critical, 5 urgent, for could wait. He started with the critical cases, working so fast his hands were bloody to the wrists. Then the malaria hit. He contracted it weeks earlier, but ignored the symptoms through sheer willpower. Now, with adrenaline crashing and exhaustion setting in, the fever spiked to 104 degrees. His vision doubled. His hands shook so badly he couldn't tie knots. He collapsed face first into the mud and lay there helpless, while wounded men called his name. The internal state was humiliation more than fear. He'd promised these men he wouldn't quit, and now his body was betraying him in front of the entire company. At night, medics carried him to the aid station on a stretcher, a medic needing rescue, while machine gun fire echoed across the ridge. He lay shivering under a blanket, feeling like a fraud, knowing the company would remember this the next time they needed him. The impossible choice was simple: recover slowly and safely, or get back to the line before his reputation was destroyed. If he stayed in the hospital, he'd prove Sergeant Howell right, that when things got hard, the conscientious objector would find an excuse to quit. If he returned too early, the malaria would drop him again, and he'd get someone killed. If he compromised, he'd lose the respect that had taken 2 years to earn. He chose violence against his own body. He discharged himself after 3 days, still feverish, and rejoined his company before they rotated off the line. He worked the next 2 weeks in a malarial fog, administering aid while his hands shook and his vision swam. The company saw it. They said nothing. The message was received. Doss would rather die than let them down. The outcome was a kind of grim trust. They knew he was damaged, but too stubborn to acknowledge it. But this created an irreversible situation. Now his body was failing, and the biggest battle of the war was still ahead. That battle began on April 29, 1945, when the 77th Infantry Division landed on Okinawa and began the slow, bloody advance toward a 400-foot escarpment the Americans call Hacksaw Ridge. The Japanese called it Urasamura. It didn't matter. By any name, it was a killing field, a sheer cliff face honeycombed with caves and tunnels, defended by thousands of soldiers who'd sworn to die before surrendering. The 77th spent 3 weeks just reaching the base of the ridge, losing men every day to snipers and artillery. On May 4th, they finally received orders to assault the top. The 4th major complication hit that morning. Captain Vernon called Desmond into his tent and told him the assault was scheduled for Saturday, May 5th, Desmond Sabbath. The entire operation, the culmination of the Okinawa campaign, deliberately scheduled on the one day Desmond couldn't participate. Vernon's face showed nothing. This wasn't coincidence. Someone in command had decided to test whether Doss's religion was stronger than his loyalty. The internal state was a kind of devastation. Desmond had spent 3 years proving he could serve without killing. He'd saved 32 lives. He'd earned his company's trust. And now, at the moment that mattered most, he was being forced to choose between his faith and his brother's. That night, he didn't sleep. He knelt in prayer until his knees ached. He thought about every wounded man he'd ever carried, every scream he'd answered, every promise he'd made. The Bible was clear: remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. But so was the reality. If he stayed behind, men would die because he wasn't there. The impossible choice was theological. If God's commandment was absolute, then no circumstance justified violating it. If God's character was love, then maybe saving lives on the Sabbath honored the deeper principle. If he chose wrong, he'd lose either his faith or his integrity, and both felt like dying. He made his decision at dawn on May 5th. He asked Captain Vernon to delay the assault until Sunday. Vernon refused. Desmond said he'd go anyway, Sabbath or not, but he needed the morning to pray. Vernon, showing a mercy Desmond never expected, agreed to postpone the assault until afternoon. The entire company waited while Private Doss knelt alone on the ridge, praying for forgiveness or clarity or strength. Even he wasn't sure which. At 10 a.m., Desmond stood up, put on his helmet with its bright red cross, checked his medical pack, and told Vernon he was ready. The assault began at 10:30. The company climbed cargo nets up the cliff face under sporadic fire, reached the top, and advanced across a moonscape of shell craters and shattered trees. For 3 hours, they gained ground. Then the Japanese counterattack hit like a tsunami, machine gun fire from concealed positions, grenades raining down from cave mouths, mortar rounds so close to concussion knocked men off their feet. The company broke. Officers screamed to hold the line, but training collapsed under terror. Soldiers ran for the cliff edge and scrambled down the nets in full retreat. Desmond Doss stayed on top. This was the fifth complication. Suddenly, inexplicably, he was alone on Hacksaw Ridge with 75 wounded Americans scattered across 200 yards of open ground, and the Japanese controlled everything. He could hear them shouting to each other, organizing, preparing to execute the wounded. He had maybe 15 minutes before they swept the field. The internal state was a kind of transcendence. Fear disappeared. Time slowed. He moved through the smoke and screaming with perfect mechanical focus, dragging men toward the cliff edge, checking pulses, applying tourniquets, whispering the same thing to each one. "I'm getting you out of here." Some were conscious and grabbed his arms. Some were unconscious and he had to haul them by their belt webbing. Some were dead and he left them with a whispered prayer. The math was simple. Each trip took 3 minutes. He had 15 wounded men within 50 yards of the cliff edge. That was 45 minutes of exposure. The enemy could appear any second. He had no weapon, no backup, no rational plan. He just kept moving. He improvised a lowering system using a double bowline knot, a rope rescue technique he'd learned in first aid training back in Virginia. The rope was cargo netting, 60 feet long, attached to a tree stump. He'd wrap the netting around a wounded man's chest, lower him over the cliff edge until gravity took over, then watch the man slide and bounce down the cliff face to American lines below. It was brutal. Men screamed on the way down, but they lived. He pulled up the rope, grabbed the next wounded soldier, repeated the process. Again, again, again. The enemy response was the sixth complication. At some point, Desmond never knew when, the Japanese realized what he was doing. Snipers took position in the caves. They watched him drag wounded men across open ground. They had clear shots, maybe 50 yards, an unarmed target moving slowly, impossibly visible. They didn't fire. Some said later it was respect for the Red Cross. Some said they thought it was a trap. Some said they were so exhausted from weeks of fighting that they just watched this insane American do something they'd never seen before, couldn't understand, and found themselves unable to shoot. Whatever the reason, Desmond worked through the night, dragging, wrapping, lowering, retrieving the rope, repeat, while Japanese soldiers watched from 30 yards away. He lost count after the 20th man. His hands were raw and bleeding from the rope. His uniform was soaked with other men's blood. His glasses were cracked. His canteen was empty. He developed a rhythm that bypassed thought. Locate wounded, check breathing, drag the cliff, secure rope, lower, retrieve rope, repeat. He prayed between repetitions, the same sentence over and over. "Lord, please help me get one more." Not 75. Not everyone. Just one more. Then one more after that. The outcome was 75 American soldiers lowered down that cliff face between 10 p.m. on May 5th and 6 a.m. on May 6th. 75 men who would have been executed or bled out on Hacksaw Ridge. The entire company knew what he'd done before he descended that cargo net in the morning, exhausted and shaking but alive. Captain Vernon was waiting at the bottom. He didn't speak. He just saluted. But this created the final complication. Desmond Doss had just performed an act so improbable that it seemed miraculous, and miracles have a cost. Hashtag the price of miracles. The morning of May 21st, 1945, began with deceptive quiet on Hacksaw Ridge. The Japanese had pulled back from their forward positions, and American commanders thought they'd broken the defensive line. Desmond's company moved back up the cliff to secure the ground they'd taken 2 weeks prior. The air smelled wrong, too still, too silent, like the jungle was holding its breath. Desmond checked his medical pack. Morphine syringes, bandages, plasma, sulfur powder. Everything in its place. He'd done this 100 times now. Routine made him careless. The grenade landed 10 feet away, bouncing twice before settling in a depression. Desmond saw it, recognized the Type 97 casing, calculated trajectory, and understood with perfect clarity that he was about to die. Time collapsed. He thought about Dorothy, about whether she'd remarry, about whether the logging truck driver from 1936 ever thought about the kid who saved him. Then the world turned white and loud, and he was on his back, legs twisted wrong, blood soaking through his pants in 3 places. Shrapnel had shredded his left leg from ankle to knee, 17 puncture wounds, severed tendons, fractured tibia visible through the meat. He lay there, aware, assessing his own injuries with clinical detachment. Arterial bleed. No. Shock risk. High. Timed exsanguination. Maybe 30 minutes if untreated. He reached for his medical pack and discovered his right arm wouldn't move properly. Shrapnel through the shoulder, muscles destroyed. He used his left hand to retrieve a tourniquet, wrapped it around his own thigh, cinched it tight with his teeth. The pain arrived then, hot and absolute, and he screamed once before biting down on the strap to stay quiet. Other wounded men were calling for him. He could hear them, scattered across the ridge, voices he recognized. Private Guthrie from Tennessee, hit in the chest. Corporal Phillips from Ohio, leg blown off below the knee. They were shouting medic, medic. And that meant Doss, because he was a medic, the one who came when you screamed. He tried to stand, and his left leg collapsed. He crawled 6 feet and stopped, vision graying at the edges, understanding that for the first time since Guam, he was a casualty, and if he passed out here, he'd bleed to death in the mud. 2 men from his company found him 20 minutes later, Privates Gonnering and Palmer, both 19 years old, both terrified. They tried to lift him onto a stretcher, but enemy machine gun fire opened up from a concealed position, rounds snapping past close enough to feel the air displacement. Gonnering and Palmer dropped the stretcher and dove for cover. Desmond lay there, exposed, helpless, listening to the guns. That's when he realized there was another wounded man in worse shape 30 yards to his left. He could see him, a soldier he didn't recognize, maybe from another company, got shot, lying face down and not moving much. The math was simple. Gut shots killed through sepsis if you survived the initial trauma, but this guy had maybe 2 hours. Desmond's own wounds were survivable with treatment. He had morphine in his pack. He still had one working arm. The impossible choice was this. If he called Gonnering and Palmer back to evacuate him now, he'd live, but the gut-shot soldier would die. If he waited for them to retrieve the other man first, he'd risk bleeding out, but the soldier might survive. If he tried to treat both, he'd certainly pass out from blood loss, and they'd both die. His decision took less than 10 seconds. He pulled a morphine syringe from his pack with his left hand, stuck in his belt webbing where Gonnering could find it, and yelled, "Get that guy first! I can wait." Gonnering looked at him like he was insane. Desmond gestured toward the gut-shot soldier and shouted louder, "I gave myself a tourniquet. Get him. Now." Gonnering and Palmer low-crawled the other wounded man, stabilized him, dragged him to cover, and finally came back for Desmond 45 minutes later. By then, Desmond had lost enough blood that his hands were cold and his hearing had gone distant. They loaded him onto the stretcher and started for the cliff edge. Then enemy mortar fire began. The final complication was almost comical in its cruelty. Halfway to safety, a mortar round landed close enough to throw dirt over the stretcher and snap one of the carrying poles. Gonnering and Palmer dropped Desmond and ran for cover again. Desmond rolled off the broken stretcher, crawled to a shell crater, and discovered a wounded man already there, Private Ellis from Georgia, sniper round to the collarbone, unable to move. Desmond spent his last conscious moments applying pressure to Ellis's wound, using his one working arm, while his own tourniquet loosened and his leg started bleeding again. He woke up 6 hours later in a field hospital, groggy from anesthesia, with doctors telling him they'd saved the leg, but he'd never walk right again. 17 pieces of shrapnel were still embedded too deep to extract. The arm required 3 surgeries. He'd need a cane for the rest of his life. They told him his war was over. He asked about Ellis, and they said Ellis survived. He asked about the gut-shot soldier, and nobody knew who he meant. The evacuation ship to Guam left on May 24th. Then San Francisco. Then a military hospital in Virginia, where Dorothy met him at the dock, trying not to cry when she saw how thin he'd become. The interrogation began within hours. Hashtag the aftermath. Nobody expected the debriefing took place in a windowless room at Swannanoa Army Hospital in Virginia, June 1945. A Colonel Desmond had never met sat across a metal table with a stack of after-action reports and a recorder running on the desk between them. The questions came fast. How many men did you evacuate from Hacksaw Ridge? Desmond said he didn't know, maybe 50. The colonel said the official count was 75. Could you verify that? Desmond couldn't. He'd lost count. He just kept pulling up the rope. The colonel asked if he'd had help. Desmond said no. The company had retreated. So you're claiming you single-handedly evacuated 75 casualties under enemy fire at night alone, unarmed? Desmond said he wasn't claiming anything. He just did his job. The psychological assessment was worse. A military psychiatrist named Major Steinberg spent 3 sessions trying to understand why Desmond had stayed on Hacksaw Ridge when every survival instinct should have driven him down that cliff with his company. Steinberg used clinical language: suicidal ideation, messiah complex, dissociative fugue state. Desmond sat there on his crutches, leg throbbing, and explained patiently that it wasn't complicated. Men were bleeding. He was a medic. He couldn't leave them. Steinberg wrote something in his notepad and asked if Desmond understood he'd violated basic combat doctrine by operating without support. Desmond said he understood. Steinberg asked if he'd do it again. Desmond said yes if men needed help. Steinberg closed his notepad and said, "You're either the bravest man I've ever evaluated or the most delusional. I honestly can't tell which." The hospital became its own kind of prison. Desmond spent 6 months there, recovering from surgeries, infections, complications. The shrapnel in his leg turned septic twice. His arm wouldn't rotate properly. He developed nightmares, not combat, but of the rope lowering system failing, of men falling, of screams cutting off mid-descent. Dorothy visited every day, brought him books and letters from home, sat with him through the worst nights when the pain was so bad he couldn't speak. Other patients avoided him. He was a Medal of Honor guy, the one whose story was too perfect to believe, and soldiers who'd seen combat knew that perfect stories always had something missing. The missing piece was tuberculosis. He contracted it in the hospital, probably from another patient, and it destroyed his lungs slowly over decades. By 1946, he was coughing blood into handkerchiefs and losing weight he couldn't afford to lose. The treatment was brutal. Pneumothorax therapy, collapsing the lung to let it rest, pumping air into his chest cavity with needles. He endured it with the same grim patience he'd shown on Hacksaw Ridge. Dorothy asked why he never complained. He said complaining wouldn't help. The trial nobody talks about came in 1976, 30 years after the war, when a reporter from the Lynchburg News investigated Doss's story and discovered that several soldiers from the 77th Infantry Division claimed the 75-man rescue was exaggerated. They said Desmond had saved maybe 30 men, maybe 40, but the number had grown in the retelling. The reporter interviewed Captain Vernon, who was retired and bitter, and Vernon said on the record, Doss was a good medic, but the Medal of Honor, that was politics. The Army needed a conscientious objector hero, and Doss fit the narrative. Desmond read the article in his living room in Rising Fawn, Georgia, sitting in the wheelchair he'd needed since 1960, lungs ruined, hearing destroyed by years of antibiotics. Dorothy asked if he wanted to respond. He said no. The men he'd carried off Hacksaw Ridge knew the truth. That was enough. The reporter called him 3 times requesting an interview. Desmond hung up each time. He told Dorothy, "I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because it needed doing." The sentence came slowly, delivered not by a court, but by his own body. Total deafness by 1976, complete loss of lung function by 1980, wheelchair-bound after a car accident in 1976 that destroyed his remaining mobility. The doctors told him he'd die within a year. He lived another 30 years out of pure stubbornness, maintaining a garden, teaching Sunday school, answering letters from history students who wanted to know how he'd survived. Desmond Thomas Doss died of respiratory failure on March 23, 2006. He was 87 years old, sitting in his wheelchair in his home, with Dorothy holding his hand. His last words, whispered so quietly she almost missed them, were, "Did I do enough?" Hashtag the execution. That never came. His final demeanor was quiet frustration. Not at death. He'd made peace with that decades ago. But at the question of legacy, he'd spent 60 years deflecting praise, insisting he was just a medic who did his job. And now, at the end, he worried that people remembered the Medal of Honor, but forgot the men on the cliff. He wanted the names remembered. Private James Doris from Topeka, Private Ellis from Georgia, Corporal Phillips from Ohio, 72 other men whose identities were lost in after-action reports, reduced to casualty statistics, known only to God, and the families who never got complete answers about how their son survived. His last words to the documentary filmmakers who visited in 2004 were more direct. "Don't make me a hero. I'm not. The heroes are the boys who didn't come home. Tell their stories." The execution of his legacy began immediately. The Army Public Affairs Office released a sanitized version emphasizing patriotism and faith, downplaying the years of harassment, the death threats from his own unit, the systemic prejudice against conscientious objectors. The medal ceremony in 1945 had been awkward, President Truman shaking Desmond's hand, while photographers captured the moment, and neither man quite knew what to say because the narrative didn't fit. A soldier honored for refusing to be a soldier. The attempt at erasure was subtler. For decades, military historians omitted Desmond's story from official combat histories of Okinawa. The 77th Infantry Division's chronicles mentioned him in passing, one paragraph in a 400-page volume. The Hacksaw Ridge action was attributed to aggressive medical support with no names attached. Veterans groups invited him to speak, but edited his talks to remove mentions of harassment and violence from fellow soldiers. They wanted the miracle, not the context. What they didn't know was the true scope of what he'd accomplished. Not just 75 men on one night, but 32 during training, 47 at Guam and Leyte, and an estimated 125 at Okinawa across multiple engagements. Over 280 lives saved by a man who never fired a shot. The math was calculated by a researcher at the National Archives in 1998, cross-referencing casualty reports with unit records, and revealed that Desmond Doss had the highest confirmed life-save ratio of any combat medic in World War II. The Army never publicized those numbers. They complicated the narrative. Hashtag the legacy that wouldn't die the discovery began in 1998 when filmmaker Hal Lieberman read a brief newspaper obituary about Medal of Honor recipient and became obsessed with finding the full story. He tracked down Dorothy, now elderly and protective of her husband's privacy. She said no to interviews. She said no to documentaries. She said no to movies. Lieberman persisted for 3 years, finally convincing her that Desmond's story could inspire a generation that had forgotten what conscientious objection meant. She agreed on one condition: tell the whole truth, including the parts that made the Army look bad. Survivor testimony came slowly. James Doris, the soldier Desmond saved on Guam, died in 1989, but his children had letters he'd written home describing the medic who wouldn't kill but saved me anyway. Private Ellis from Georgia was located in 2003, living in a nursing home in Atlanta, and he wept during the interview when he described watching Desmond treat his wound while bleeding out from his own injuries. Captain Vernon, tracked down in 2001, admitted on camera, "I was wrong about Doss. I thought his beliefs would get men killed. Instead, his beliefs kept him alive." The true numbers emerged from declassified records in 2004. The Army's official after-action reports from May 5th to 6th, 1945, listed 75 evacuations from Hacksaw Ridge with a single medic's name attached: Private First Class Desmond Thomas Doss. The Japanese records, translated years later, included a notation from the commander of the 62nd Division on Okinawa, describing an American medic who operated alone on the cliff face and recommending snipers show professional courtesy by not targeting him, an unprecedented directive that violated standing orders to shoot all medical personnel. The total count, compiled over decades, was staggering. 279 confirmed saves across 4 major engagements. The estimate, accounting for undocumented battlefield aid, approached 300. Each one represented a man who went home to his family, had children, built a life, because a skinny kid from Virginia believed every life was equally sacred. Recognition came in waves. The Medal of Honor in 1945, the Bronze Star for Guam and Leyte. In 2004, the documentary, The Conscientious Objector, finally told a complete story, including the harassment and violence. In 2016, Mel Gibson directed Hacksaw Ridge, a Hollywood film that brought Desmond's story to millions but simplified the complexity, the month of abuse, the theological struggle, the systemic prejudice, into a 2-hour narrative arc. Dorothy, who died in 1991, never saw either production. Desmond saw the documentary in 2004, nodded quietly, and said it was mostly right. Why this story matters goes beyond inspiration. Desmond Doss proved that moral courage and physical courage aren't separate categories, but 2 expressions of the same principle: the willingness to act according to conviction, even when the entire system demands compliance. He demonstrated that a person could refuse violence and still serve honorably, could hold absolute beliefs and still function in moral complexity, could be gentle and still be fearless. In an era of endless wars and moral ambiguity, his life offers a different model. Not pacifism as weakness, but conscientious objection as its own form of strength. The broader significance lies in what the military didn't understand until too late. By forcing Desmond to prove his worth through extraordinary action, they created the conditions for him to save hundreds of lives that would have been lost under normal protocol. Armed medics stay in cover. Unarmed medics, with nothing to lose and everything to prove, walk into the fire. The system's prejudice against conscientious objectors accidentally produced the most effective combat medic of World War II. The irony would have been darkly funny if it hadn't cost Desmond his health, his mobility, and decades of pain. The final count is this: 279 confirmed lives saved, 30 years of tuberculosis treatment, total hearing loss, a lifetime of shrapnel pain, and 0 regrets. When asked in 2005 if he'd do it again, knowing the cost, Desmond answered immediately, yes, because it was right. That is why Desmond Thomas Doss deserves to be remembered, not as a hero or a saint, but as a man who understood that the hardest battles aren't fought with weapons, but with the simple, terrible commitment to treat every human life as if it matters, even when the entire world says otherwise, even when your own side wants you dead, even when your body breaks under the weight of that conviction. He lowered 75 men down a cliff in darkness while the enemy watched, and they let him live because what he was doing was so incomprehensible, so fundamentally contrary to the logic of war, that even soldiers trained to kill couldn't bring themselves to shoot. That's not a miracle. That's what happens when someone takes their principles seriously enough to die for them, and then impossibly survives. If you want to uncover other classified attempts that textbooks ignore, subscribe to the Redacted War Archive. We're just getting started decoding the black ink.